Arthur Cunningham leaned against the rusted iron gate of Children's Haven, his eyes drifting across the playground. What was meant to be a routine visit, just another attempt to fill the emptiness left by the loss of his family 18 years ago, felt different today. There was an unfamiliar heaviness in the air, a kind of magnetic pull he couldn't quite explain. As he watched the children play, their laughter blending with the crisp autumn wind, for a fleeting moment, the world seemed to lighten, almost as if at peace, as he made his way across the courtyard. His gaze landed on a young man surrounded by a group of laughing children. The man was tall with dark, slightly curled hair and a smile so warm, it seemed to brighten the entire yard. There was something about him, something eerily familiar, that stirred a faint memory in Arthur's mind. He stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his chest. Who was this young man? The headmistress, who had appeared at his side, noticed his lingering gaze and followed it. "Oh, that's William," she said with a fond smile. "He's been here for years now. The kids adore him." "William," Arthur repeated, the name echoing in his head. He couldn't shake the sensation that he knew this man from somewhere, but that was impossible. His son Andrew had died in that tragic accident so many years ago. There was no way this young man could be him. The headmistress, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him, continued. "He arrived here 18 years ago with no memory of his past. Poor thing. He's grown up here with us. Now he helps with the younger ones. A natural caretaker. 18 years. The exact same amount of time Andrew had been gone. The coincidence was too striking to dismiss. Arthur's heart began to race, and an irrational hope, wild and desperate, began to spark inside him. "May I meet him?" Arthur asked, trying to steady his voice. "Of course," the headmistress replied, leading him toward the young man. As they approached, William looked up, his bright blue eyes meeting Arthur's gaze for a brief but intense moment. Arthur felt a strange jolt, like he was staring into the past. This was Andrew's face. Or at least a version of it. "This is Mr. Cunningham," the headmistress introduced, smiling warmly. "He's one of our most generous benefactors." William's handshake was firm yet gentle. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir," he said with a sincerity that sent a chill through Arthur. "Thank you for everything you've done for the children here." Arthur struggled to find his words, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "The pleasure is mine, William," he finally managed. "You're doing wonderful work with the children. They clearly think very highly of you." William's smile deepened, the kind of smile that came easily, naturally. "They're like family to me," he said simply. "This place is all I've ever known." Arthur nodded, though his mind was racing. All he'd ever known. No memory of his past. Could it really be possible? As they spoke, Arthur found himself noticing subtle similarities, small, almost imperceptible things, like the way William tilted his head when he listened, or the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. It was as if he were looking at Andrew's ghost, grown, but unmistakably the same. But Arthur knew he couldn't let himself get carried away. The mind had a way of playing tricks, especially when grief clouded judgment. He couldn't afford to let his hope blind him to the truth. Still, the need to know, to find out if this could really be Andrew, was overwhelming. "William," Arthur said, his tone carefully neutral, "if you ever want to talk about your past, or if there's anything I can do to help you uncover it, don't hesitate to reach out. Sometimes revisiting old memories is tough, but it's important to understand where you come from." William's smile wavered just slightly, but he nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Cunningham. I've always wondered about my past, but I guess I'm afraid of what I might find." Arthur understood that fear more than he wanted to admit. He also knew from painful experience that the truth, no matter how difficult, was always better than the uncertainty. "You're not alone in this," he said gently. "Remember that." As they parted ways, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. This brief encounter had cracked open a door to the past that he had long thought sealed tight. And now, standing on the edge of what could be a new chapter, Arthur felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. But with that hope there was also a flicker of fear. If William was truly Andrew, there was darkness in the past they would both have to confront. And if he wasn't, Arthur didn't want to think about that. For now, all he could do was take the first step into this uncertain new reality. When Arthur returned to his penthouse in Manhattan, his mind was still racing from the encounter at Children's Haven. The image of William's face lingered in his thoughts, the way his eyes seemed to hold unspoken secrets, secrets that perhaps even William wasn't aware of. The similarities to Andrew were undeniable. But Arthur knew better than to act on intuition alone. He needed proof. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city, as Arthur sat at his desk, staring at a photograph of Valerie and Andrew, taken just a week before the accident. Andrew had been 8 years old then, full of life and energy. His dark hair and piercing blue eyes, traits that had always seemed so uniquely his, Arthur had convinced himself he would never see them again. But now, Arthur picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Cunningham," the voice drawled. "Tom, it's Arthur. I need your help," Arthur said, trying to steady his nerves. "Arthur. It's been a while," Tom replied, his voice laced with surprise. "What's going on?" Arthur hesitated, unsure how to explain the maelstrom of emotions swirling inside him. I think I've found my son, Andrew." There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Arthur, I thought Andrew was. After all this time?" "I know what you're thinking," Arthur interrupted. "And believe me, I thought the same thing. But today I met someone, a young man named William. He's about the same age Andrew would be now, and there's something about him, something that makes me think it could be him." Tom fell silent for a moment, then spoke more seriously. "You want me to look into this, William?" "Yes," Arthur replied, his voice steady but urgent. "He was left at Children's Haven 18 years ago with no memory of his past. I need you to find out everything you can about him, who he is, where he came from." "I'll get started right away," Tom said. "But Arthur, you need to brace yourself. This may not be the answer you're hoping for." "I know," Arthur said quietly. "But I have to know, Tom. I can't keep living like this, caught between hope and doubt." After hanging up, Arthur leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He knew Tom would dig deep. He always did. But even with the best investigator on the case, there was no guarantee they would find the answers Arthur so desperately sought. Still, the possibility that William could be Andrew was too powerful to ignore. As the days passed, Arthur found himself returning to Children's Haven more frequently, always under the pretense of checking on the progress of the charity work he was funding. But with each visit, his true purpose was clear: to find an opportunity to speak with William, to subtly dig for any details that might confirm the growing suspicions in his mind. Yet, despite his efforts, William remained an enigma, kind and open-hearted, but closed off when it came to his past. One afternoon, as they strolled through the orphanage's peaceful gardens, Arthur decided to approach the topic more directly. "William," he began casually, "have you ever thought about trying to learn more about where you came from?" William looked up at the blooming flowers, his gaze distant. He shrugged slightly. "I've thought about it," he said, his voice soft. "But I don't even know where to start. I've always been told I was found alone, no ID, nothing. It's like my life began the day I arrived here." Arthur felt a pang in his chest, his heart aching for this young man who seemed so lost in the past he couldn't remember. "Sometimes the past can be painful," he said gently. "But it's also where we find the answers to who we really are. If you ever want to search for those answers, I'm here to help." William smiled, though there was a subtle sadness in his eyes. "I appreciate that, Mr. Cunningham. Maybe one day I'll be ready." As the weeks stretched on, Arthur's anticipation only grew. He knew Tom was working tirelessly on his investigation, but the waiting, endless and agonizing, was starting to wear on him. Each time his phone rang, his heart would race, only to sink when it wasn't Tom with the breakthrough he so desperately needed. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the call came. Arthur could hear the gravity in Tom's voice even before he spoke. "Arthur, I found something," Tom said, his tone somber. "But it's not as straightforward as you might think." Arthur's grip tightened on the phone. "What did you find?" "There's no record of William's existence before he was brought to the orphanage," Tom explained. "No birth certificate, no hospital records, nothing. It's like he appeared out of thin air." Arthur froze, the words sinking in slowly. So what does that mean? I'm not sure yet, Tom admitted. But I'm going to dig deeper. There has to be something we're missing. I'll need more time. Arthur thanked him, but his mind was already racing, filled with more questions than answers. The more he learned, the more elusive William's past became. And yet, the possibility that William was Andrew only seemed to grow stronger in Arthur's mind. There was a connection there, he could feel it, something that linked them in a way he couldn't fully explain. That night, as Arthur gazed out at the sprawling city skyline from his penthouse, he wondered if the truth he sought might be more dangerous than he ever realized. But he had come too far to stop now. He would uncover the truth no matter what it cost. Each morning, Arthur's routine had come to be defined by a restless anticipation. Every day, he woke with the hope that Tom's call would bring him closer to the answers he longed for. The days stretched on, filled with the usual flurry of charity meetings and business affairs, but they felt meaningless in comparison to the mystery that was consuming him. Then one brisk morning, as Arthur was midway through a meeting, his phone buzzed. He excused himself, quickly answering the call. "Arthur," Tom said, his voice brimming with excitement. "I've got something." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "Meet me at my office," Tom replied. "It's better if we talk in person." Without hesitation, Arthur wrapped up his meeting with the urgency his colleagues had come to expect in recent weeks. Within an hour he was sitting across from Tom in his small, cluttered office, the familiar scent of stale coffee and old books filling the air. Tom slid a thick folder across the desk toward him. "These are the adoption records from Children's Haven," Tom began, his voice low. "Or more accurately, the lack of them." Arthur frowned as he opened the folder. It was unnervingly thin. "What do you mean?" Tom leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. According to the official records, William was never legally adopted by the orphanage. There's a note about his arrival, but it's vague. No details about who brought him in or where he was found. Just a brief mention of a good Samaritan who dropped him off. Arthur sifted through the papers, a deep frown creasing his brow. "This doesn't make sense. There should be more here. More information." "Exactly," Tom said. "It's like someone went out of their way to erase his history. And the timing. It lines up with the accident that took your wife and son. But there's more." Tom reached into the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, handing it over to Arthur. "When I cross-referenced the timeline with local hospital records, I found something interesting." Arthur's eyes skimmed over the paper, a hospital discharge form from the same day William had been left at the orphanage. "A patient was admitted to a nearby hospital the night of the accident," Tom explained. "A young boy around 8 years old, with injuries consistent with a car crash. The name on the form? Jundu. No ID. No records of anyone looking for him." Arthur's pulse quickened as he stared at the paper. "And this boy? You think it could have been Andrew?" "I think it's a strong possibility," Tom replied. "The description matches what little we know about William's condition when he arrived at the orphanage. It's too much of a coincidence to ignore." Arthur's hands trembled slightly as he set the paper down. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the image they were forming still felt unclear. "So what do we do now?" "I've been looking into the Good Samaritan mentioned in the orphanage records," Tom said. "There's no name attached, but I found a reference to a local church that might have been involved. It's a long shot, but it's the only lead we have." Arthur's resolve hardened. "Follow it. Whatever it takes. I need to know who brought William to that orphanage and why." Tom nodded, agreeing to dig deeper. As Arthur left the office, his mind was a whirlpool of hope and dread. If William truly was Andrew, then the last 18 years of his life had been built on a web of lies. But whose lies? And for what purpose? That evening, Arthur returned to Children's Haven, unable to stay away. He found William in the library, reading to a group of children. The sight of him, so gentle and kind, almost brought tears to Arthur's eyes. Could this really be his son, the boy he had lost, now a man with no memory of his past? After the children left, Arthur approached William, who looked up at him with a welcoming smile. "Mr. Cunningham," William greeted, closing the book he had been reading. "It's good to see you again." "And you, William," Arthur replied, his voice thick with emotion. He struggled to contain it as he sat down beside him. For a moment, the words he wanted to say caught in his throat. Instead, he simply asked, "How have you been?" William shrugged, his easy smile never faltering. "Same as always, I suppose. The kids keep me busy and I like it that way." Arthur nodded, his mind racing, unsure how to navigate the conversation that weighed so heavily on him. He had to be careful. "William," he began, his voice betraying none of the unease gnawing at him. "Have you ever considered? Do you ever feel like something's missing? Like there's something about your past that doesn't quite add up?" William glanced at him curiously, his smile faltering just a little. "Of course," he said quietly. "Sometimes I wonder why I don't remember anything before the orphanage, but I've made peace with it. My life here is good and I've learned not to look back too much." Arthur felt a tightness in his chest as he listened. He desperately wanted to tell William everything, to lay bare the investigation, the evidence pointing to the possibility that he was Andrew. But he knew he had to wait. He couldn't risk giving William false hope without definitive proof. "Not yet." "That's understandable," Arthur said, carefully choosing his words. "But if you ever feel like searching for those missing pieces, I'm here to help, no matter what it takes." William met his gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I appreciate that, Mr. Cunningham. Really I do." They sat in silence after that, the soft murmur of the orphanage in the background, but to Arthur, it was as if the world had closed in around them. The questions that had been swirling in his mind, the ones that seemed to multiply with every new piece of information, pressed down on him harder now. The deeper he dug into William's past, the more convoluted and dangerous the mystery became. And with each new revelation, the stakes grew higher. He couldn't back down now. He had to find the truth no matter what it cost. But as the investigation continued, Arthur's growing unease turned into something darker, something he could no longer ignore. The truth, as much as he wanted it, seemed to carry with it a heavy price. And the more he thought about it, the more he feared the consequences might not only fall on him but also on William, the young man who had no idea of the storm he was about to be dragged into. Arthur's thoughts turned to his brother James. Their relationship had always been complicated. But in the years since Valerie and Andrew's tragic deaths, the distance between them had only grown wider, colder. James had always been more ambitious, more fixated on wealth and power than family. In the wake of the accident, while Arthur threw himself into philanthropy and charitable works, James had used the tragedy as an opportunity to expand his influence, climbing higher on the backs of the family legacy, often at the expense of it. Arthur had told James nothing about William, nothing about his suspicions or the investigation. He knew that if anyone had the power to complicate the situation, it was James. James had a sixth sense for detecting any threat to his carefully curated world of control and ambition. If he even suspected Arthur was close to uncovering something important, he wouldn't hesitate to interfere. It was late one evening as Arthur sat in his study, the weight of the investigation pressing on him, that his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, seeing James's name, and his stomach dropped. They hadn't spoken in weeks, and the timing of this call felt too convenient. Reluctantly, Arthur answered. "James," he said, his voice steady, though a knot formed in his throat. "What is it?" James's voice, smooth and almost too pleasant, came through the receiver. "Arthur. It's been a while. How are you?" Arthur narrowed his eyes. He knew this tone. It was the calm before the storm. "I'm fine, James. What do you want?" James chuckled softly, a sound that sent a chill down Arthur's spine. "Straight to business as always. I was just thinking. It's been too long since we last talked. We should catch up." Arthur's instincts flared. He didn't believe for a second this was a casual conversation. "Is there something specific you wanted to discuss?" he asked, his voice clipped. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough to make Arthur's heart rate spike. When James spoke again, his tone was laced with something darker. "Actually, yes," he said, his voice smooth but somehow sharper. "I've been hearing some interesting things lately. Rumors, you might say, about you spending quite a bit of time at that orphanage. Children's Haven, is it?" Arthur's stomach tightened. So James had been keeping tabs on him. He forced his voice to remain calm. "I'm involved in several charitable efforts, as you know. Children's Haven is just one of them. James hummed in acknowledgement, though there was a distinct edge to the sound. Of course, he said smoothly. But from what I hear, your interest in this particular place has been personal, especially regarding a young man who works there. Arthur's blood ran cold. William, he said flatly. I believe his name is. James's words, smooth as silk but heavy with insinuation, hit Arthur like a punch to the gut. What are you getting at, James? James's voice dropped, taking on a darker undertone. Oh, nothing. I just find it curious. You've never taken such an interest in any of your other projects. Makes one wonder what's so special about this boy. Arthur's hand clenched around the phone, his anger rising. He fought to keep his voice even. He reminds me of someone, that's all. I've been trying to help him figure out his past. James's laugh was low, almost predatory. His past? He repeated, savoring the words. That's quite noble of you, Arthur. But I do hope you're not letting sentiment cloud your judgment. You've always had a bit of a blind spot when it comes to family, haven't you? Arthur's jaw clenched. The thinly veiled threat in his brother's words was unmistakable. If you're implying something, just say it. James's laughter was cold, almost mocking. I'm not implying anything, dear brother. I'm merely offering some advice. His voice grew colder. Be careful. Digging into the past can uncover things you might not be ready to face. And sometimes it's better to leave certain stones unturned. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. He knew James well enough to recognize a veiled warning when he heard one. But the anger that surged within him pushed back against his fear. I appreciate your concern, James, he said, his voice colder than he intended. But I know what I'm doing. James's voice softened, as if he were speaking to a child. I'm sure you do, Arthur. Just remember, sometimes the past is best left buried. With that, James hung up, leaving Arthur staring at the phone, his heart pounding, his mind reeling. There was no doubt now. James knew. James was aware of his investigation, and the more Arthur thought about it, the more it seemed probable, that James had a role to play in the events that had shattered their family all those years ago. A terrifying thought. But Arthur knew deep in his gut that he had to push forward, no matter the cost. The stakes had never been higher. And with James circling like a shark, Arthur was sure the battle for the truth was only just beginning. Arthur's visits to Children's Haven became more frequent, not just to observe William, but to offer him the stability that Arthur himself so desperately needed. The orphanage had become a sanctuary, a place where he could escape the weight of his thoughts, even if only for a little while. Their conversations, though often heavy with an unspoken sadness, gave Arthur a sense of purpose. William's kindness and gentle nature, so at odds with the turmoil Arthur felt inside, deepened his resolve to protect him. Despite the uncertainty that loomed over their lives, one chilly afternoon, Arthur arrived at the orphanage to find the building unusually quiet. The usual laughter and energy of the children were absent, replaced instead by an eerie stillness that seemed to hang in the air. As Arthur stepped inside, he made his way toward the library and found William seated at one of the large wooden tables, absorbed in a book, though his expression was distant. When William saw him, he looked up, offering a small, almost apologetic smile. "Mr. Cunningham," he greeted him, his voice quieter than usual. "The kids are all out on a field trip. I stayed behind to catch up on some reading." Arthur nodded, scanning the room before settling his gaze on William. Something about his expression was different today, less guarded but more troubled. "Are you all right, William?" Arthur asked, his voice soft, the concern evident in his tone. "You seem preoccupied." William sighed and closed the book he had been pretending to read, his fingers absently tracing the edges of the cover. "I've been having these dreams," he said quietly, his voice edged with confusion. "Or maybe they're memories. It's hard to tell." Arthur's heart skipped a beat, the mention of dreams piquing his interest immediately. "What kind of dreams?" he asked, leaning forward slightly, careful not to press too hard, yet unable to hide his growing concern. William hesitated, his brow furrowing as he tried to piece together the fragments of the images that had been haunting him. "They're strange," he said, his voice low. "Like I'm seeing things from another life. There's a car. A woman's voice, but I can't make out what she's saying. And then there's this feeling of fear. Like something terrible is about to happen. Arthur's chest tightened at the words. His pulse quickened. The woman. The car. Could be. But he had to tread carefully. His mind raced, asking the questions he wanted to say but knew he couldn't. Do these dreams feel real to you? Like they could be memories? He asked, his voice gentle but laced with urgency. William's fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, his eyes dropping to the table. I'm not sure, he said, his voice almost a whisper. I've never remembered anything from before the orphanage, so it's hard to say. But these dreams, they're different. They stay with me even after I wake up. Arthur leaned forward, his tone insistent yet reassuring. William, it's possible that your mind is trying to tell you something. Something important about your past. He paused, giving William a moment to process his words. Have you ever thought about trying to explore these memories further? William looked up at him, eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. I have, he admitted softly. But what if I don't like what I find? What if it changes everything? Arthur could understand that fear. Sometimes the truth can be difficult to face, he said, his voice filled with quiet empathy. But it's the only way to move forward. If these memories are connected to your past, then maybe they hold the key to understanding who you really are. William nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the window where the late afternoon light cast long shadows across the room. I suppose you're right. I've always wanted to know where I came from, but I guess I've been afraid of what that might mean. Arthur reached out, placing a reassuring hand on William's shoulder. You're not alone in this, he said, his voice steady. Whatever we find, we'll face it together. For a moment, William didn't speak, simply absorbing the comfort of Arthur's words. Then with a deep breath he nodded. Okay, let's do it. Let's find out the truth. Later that evening, Arthur contacted a specialist in hypnotherapy, someone who could help William access the buried memories in his subconscious. The process would be delicate, requiring patience and care, but Arthur was determined to give William every possible chance to unlock his past. A few days later, William found himself sitting in the dimly lit office of Dr. Margaret Ellis, the hypnotherapist. Arthur had insisted on being present, offering his support as William prepared to confront the fragments of his forgotten life. Dear. Ellis exuded calm. Her presence was soothing, her voice soft as she explained the process. William, we're going to take this one step at a time, Dr. Ellis said gently. You're in control at all times, and you can stop whenever you feel uncomfortable. My goal is to help you explore these memories safely, without causing you any distress. William nodded, though Arthur could see the nerves playing on his face. He glanced at Arthur, who offered a reassuring smile. I'm ready, William said, settling back in the chair as Dr. Ellis began the session, guiding him into a relaxed, meditative state. Arthur watched closely, his own heart pounding with a mix of hope and trepidation. As the minutes passed, Arthur saw the tension in William's face gradually ease as he slipped into a deeper level of consciousness. Dr. Ellis spoke softly, her voice a steady presence in the room. William, I want you to focus on the dreams you've been having. Let your mind wander back to that place. To that moment. What do you see? There was a long pause, during which Arthur's heart raced with anticipation. But then William's voice, low and hesitant, broke the silence. I'm in a car, he said, his voice strained. It's dark outside and it's raining. There's a woman beside me. I think she's my mother. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He leaned forward, hanging on every word. She's speaking to me, but I can't understand what she's saying, William continued, his brow furrowing as if he were trying to pull more of the image into focus. I'm scared. I don't know why, but I'm terrified. Dr. Ellis nodded, her voice encouraging but gentle. What happens next, William? Try to focus on the sounds, the smells, anything that can help you remember. William's face twisted in pain, and Arthur's chest tightened as he watched. There's a crash, William said, his voice trembling. The car is spinning out of control. I hear metal crunching, glass shattering. And then nothing. It's just dark. Dear. Ellis slowly brought William out of the hypnotic state, guiding him back to the present. When William opened his eyes, he looked shaken but also somehow relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Arthur reached out, squeezing his hand. "You did great, William," he said softly. "We're getting closer." But even as he said the words, Arthur knew that this was only the beginning. The memories William had uncovered raised more questions than answers. What really happened that night? What role, if any, had James played in it? The path ahead was fraught with danger, and the deeper they went, the more the shadows of the past threatened to consume them. Arthur's world was beginning to feel like a puzzle with missing pieces. Each new fragment of William's memories pushing him closer to answers, yet also deeper into a web of uncertainty. But there was another thread to follow, one that had been haunting him since Tom's discovery. The possibility that Valerie, his wife, might still be alive. The idea that Valerie could have survived the accident and been hidden away all these years was almost too painful to bear, but the evidence Tom had uncovered, those faint, untraceable leads, was impossible to ignore. Arthur knew he had to confront this possibility, no matter how devastating it might be. He reached out to Tom again, urging him to pursue every lead, every shadowy connection that might point to Valerie's whereabouts. If there was any chance she was still alive, Arthur needed to know. A few days later, Tom called. Arthur's heart pounded as he listened to Tom's calm, methodical voice on the other end of the line. "I found something, Arthur." Tom's voice crackled through the phone. "But it's complicated." Arthur's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" Tom hesitated for a moment before continuing, his voice lowering. "There's a clinic. A private facility. Very discreet. It's the kind of place where people go when they want to stay off the radar." He paused. "I've been digging into their records, and there's someone there. Someone who matches Valerie's description." Arthur felt as if the ground had dropped out from under him. "Are you saying she's alive?" he asked, the words almost too painful to speak aloud. Tom's voice softened. "I can't confirm it without seeing her for myself, but the woman they have there has been in a coma for years. The clinic is under strict orders to keep her condition quiet. No names, no records that can be easily traced. But based on what I found, it could be her." A flood of emotions nearly overwhelmed Arthur. Anger, hope, fear. They all mingled together, making it hard to think clearly. "Where is this place?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Tom gave him the address, a secluded location on the outskirts of the city. "I've arranged for you to visit. But Arthur, be prepared if it is her. She's been through a lot." He hesitated. "And if it isn't her?" "Well, you need to be ready for that too." Arthur barely managed a tight "Thank you" before hanging up. He sat in stunned silence for a moment, his mind racing, struggling to comprehend the enormity of the news. His heart pounded in his chest, and yet there was no time to waste. With a deep breath, he grabbed his coat and headed out the door. He couldn't wait any longer. The thought of seeing Valerie again, of finding out the truth, was unbearable. He had to know. The drive to the clinic felt like a blur. Arthur barely noticed the passing scenery, his mind consumed by the thought of Valerie, alive, possibly alive, and what that would mean. He tried to brace himself for whatever he might find, but a nagging sense of dread settled deep in his stomach. When he arrived, the building was exactly as Tom had described. Small, nondescript, and surrounded by tall, shadowy trees that seemed to shield it from the outside world. Arthur stepped out of the car, his pulse racing as he approached the entrance. A nurse stood waiting, as if she had been expecting him. She didn't speak, only nodded in greeting, then led him through the quiet, sterile corridors of the clinic. The only sound was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, a constant, monotonous buzz that seemed to echo in the empty hallways. Finally, they stopped outside a private room. The nurse turned to him, her expression softening with sympathy. "She's inside," she said quietly. "Take your time." Arthur nodded, but his throat was tight, and his legs felt weak as he pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, the soft beeping of the medical machines the only sound that broke the stillness. And there, lying motionless on the bed, was Valerie. She looked older, thinner, her once vibrant hair now streaked with gray. But it was her. Arthur knew it in an instant, despite the years and the toll of time. Her face, even in its pallor, was unmistakable. Arthur's knees buckled, and he had to steady himself against the doorframe as the full weight of the moment hit him. She was alive. She had been alive all this time. hidden away in a coma for nearly 2 decades. He approached the bed slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. His hand trembled as he reached out to touch hers. Her skin was cool, her fingers limp in his grasp. For a moment he couldn't move, could barely breathe. "Valerie," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. I've found you." But there was no response. No recognition. Only the steady rise and fall of her chest, the ventilator doing its work. Arthur sat beside her, feeling the enormity of the years lost, of everything that had been taken from him, taken from them. His mind swirled with questions. How had she ended up here? Why had she been kept hidden for so long? And most urgently, who was responsible? As he sat there, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of what he was facing, the door creaked open behind him. He turned to see a doctor entering the room. His expression was somber. "Mr. Cunningham?" The doctor greeted him softly.
"I'm Dr. Monroe.
"I've been overseeing your wife's care." Arthur stood, his voice barely above a whisper. "How is she? Why is she here?" Dr. Monroe sighed, motioning for Arthur to sit back down. "It's a long story," he began. "Your wife was brought here many years ago, shortly after the accident. She was in critical condition, severe head trauma, multiple fractures. It's a miracle she survived at all." Arthur's mind reeled. "Who brought her here?" he demanded. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Dr. Monroe looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. "That part is unclear. She was brought in by a private party. They paid for her care in full, but they were very clear about keeping her presence here confidential. No names, no visits, no contact with anyone outside the clinic. I'm sorry, Mr. Cunningham, but I don't know who they were or why they wanted to keep her hidden." Arthur's thoughts immediately went to James. Could his brother have been involved? The idea seemed monstrous, too terrible to contemplate. But given what he had learned in recent days, nothing seemed impossible anymore. "Is there any chance she could wake up?" Arthur asked, his voice cracking with desperation. Dr. Monroe hesitated, his expression solemn. "Her condition is stable, but it's difficult to say. Cases like hers are unpredictable. I won't give you false hope, Mr. Cunningham. But as long as she's alive, there's always a chance." Arthur nodded, though his heart ached with the uncertainty of it all. He turned his gaze back to Valerie lying there, so close yet so far away. The woman he had loved, the woman he had mourned, was right here before him. But the question of who had kept her here and why loomed large in his mind as he left the clinic that evening. Arthur's resolve hardened. He would find out who had done this to Valerie, and he would make them pay. And as much as he dreaded the answer, he knew he had to confront the possibility that his own brother might be involved. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but the picture they were forming was more horrifying than Arthur could have imagined. Arthur drove home from the clinic in a daze, his mind racing with the implications of what he had discovered. Valerie was alive. She had been hidden away for years, kept in a coma in a secretive clinic while Arthur had mourned her death. The betrayal, the audacity of it all, crushed him. As soon as he arrived home, he called Tom. The investigator had been thorough up to this point, but now Arthur needed him to dig deeper, to pursue the darkest corners of the past. "Tom." Arthur's voice was tight with urgency. "I need you to focus on one thing, James. I want to know everything about his movements after the accident. Every decision he made, every person he spoke to, every dollar he spent. I need to know if he had any connection to that clinic." Tom's voice came through clear and steady. "I'm on it, Arthur. Give me a few days and I'll get back to you with everything I find." Arthur hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on him. He slumped into his chair, staring at the photo of Valerie and Andrew on his desk. It had been taken so long ago, before everything had unraveled. A surge of determination filled him. He wouldn't rest until he had the truth, no matter how dark it turned out to be. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Arthur continued his visits to Children's Haven. His interactions with William, though still meaningful, grew increasingly charged with unspoken questions. William seemed to sense that something was changing, that there was more at stake than just his own lost memories. But he didn't push Arthur for answers. Instead of dwelling on the overwhelming revelations, Arthur focused on the children at Children's Haven, grounding himself in their simplicity and innocence. He found solace in their needs, as if caring for them might hold the growing storm of his own emotions at bay. But his phone rang, shattering the fragile calm. "Arthur, I found something," Tom said, his voice somber. "It's worse than we thought." Arthur's heart sank. "What is it, Tom? Just tell me." "I traced payments to that clinic," Tom explained, his voice heavy. "They came from a shell company, one that James set up shortly after the accident. There are records of large transfers, all pointing back to him. He's been funding Valerie's care all these years, keeping her hidden. But that's not all." Arthur gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles white. "Go on." "There's evidence that James was involved in the accident itself," Tom continued, his tone grave. "I found communications between him and a man named Victor Delgado, a known fixer for hire. Delgado was paid a significant sum just days before the accident. It looks like James orchestrated the whole thing. He wanted to eliminate you and your family. When it didn't go as planned, he covered his tracks by hiding Valerie." Arthur was stunned into silence. The enormity of the betrayal felt like a tidal wave crashing down on him. His own brother, James, had been behind the accident, the death of his son, the disappearance of his wife, and all the while James had played the role of the supportive sibling. "Arthur, I know this is a lot to take in," Tom said gently, "but you need to decide what you're going to do. This isn't just about finding the truth anymore. This is about justice." Arthur nodded, though Tom couldn't see him. "I need proof, Tom. Irrefutable proof. I'm going to confront him, but I want to make sure he can't weasel his way out of this." "I'll get you what you need," Tom promised. "Give me a bit more time." Arthur hung up, his mind in chaos. He couldn't confront James until he had all the evidence in hand, but the waiting was unbearable. The man who had destroyed his family was still out there, living his life while Valerie lay in a coma, and Andrew was gone. Or was he? The thought haunted Arthur. Since his encounter with William, something in the back of his mind had been stirring. If James had been behind the accident, was there a chance that Andrew had somehow survived? The memories William had recovered during his hypnotherapy sessions seemed to align too closely with the events of that night. Could William be Andrew, hidden away like Valerie to keep him from James's reach? The next day, Arthur returned to Children's Haven with a renewed sense of purpose. He found William in the garden, helping one of the younger children plant a tree. The sight of him, so at ease, so connected to these children, filled Arthur with bittersweet longing. "William," Arthur called out as he approached, his voice thick with emotion. William looked up, smiling as the child ran off to fetch more soil. "Mr. Cunningham, good to see you." Arthur struggled to find the right words. The weight of everything he had learned made it difficult to speak. Finally, he decided there was no easy way to do this. "William, I need to talk to you about something important," Arthur began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "It's about your past." William's expression grew serious as he gestured for Arthur to sit beside him on the garden bench. "What is it?" Arthur took a deep breath, meeting William's gaze. I believe you might be my son, Andrew." William stared at him, shocked. "What? How?" Arthur quickly explained everything. His suspicions, the investigation, the memories William had begun to recover. He watched as William's face shifted from disbelief to confusion, and then to something deeper, something more profound. "I don't know what to say," William finally managed, his voice trembling. "I've always wondered who I really was, but to think that I might be your son." "I know it's a lot to take in," Arthur said gently, "and we don't have all the answers yet. But I need you to know that no matter what happens, you're not alone in this. We're going to figure it out together." William nodded, though he seemed dazed by the revelation. "What do we do now?" Arthur reached out, placing a reassuring hand on William's shoulder. "First, we need to confirm everything through DNA testing, through whatever means necessary. And then we confront the man who's been behind all of this. My brother, James." William's eyes widened as the gravity of the situation sank in. "Your brother? He did all of this?" Arthur nodded, his expression grim. "And now it's time to make sure he pays for it." Arthur could hardly believe how much his life had changed in such a short time. The revelation about William, the discovery of Valerie's hidden existence, and the horrifying truth about James's involvement had all collided in a way that left him reeling. But now, with William beside him and the evidence Tom was gathering, Arthur knew the time for action had come. The first step was to confirm beyond any doubt that William was indeed Andrew. Arthur arranged for a private DNA test, knowing that this would provide the final piece of proof. The process took a few days, and though it was excruciating to wait, Arthur understood that patience was crucial. In the meantime, Tom continued to dig into James's connections, uncovering more of the dark web of deceit and manipulation that had ensnared Arthur's family for nearly 2 decades. Finally, the results arrived. Arthur and William met at a discreet location away from the eyes of the public or any potential spies. The air was thick with tension as Arthur opened the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. "Whatever happens," Arthur began, looking at William with a mixture of hope and fear, "I want you to know that you're already a part of my life. This won't change that." William nodded, his expression unreadable as he waited for Arthur to read the results. The seconds stretched into an eternity as Arthur scanned the document. Then his breath caught in his throat. The results were clear. William was Andrew. The confirmation hit Arthur like a tidal wave. Relief, joy, and anger all crashing together. His son was alive. He had been right there within reach all this time. "It's true," Arthur whispered, his voice breaking. "You're Andrew, my son." Andrew, no. William stared at him, his emotions warring on his face. Slowly, a tear slipped down his cheek as he processed the truth. "I never thought. I never imagined," Andrew stammered, his voice thick with emotion. Arthur reached out, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I've missed you so much," he murmured, unable to hold back his own tears. "I thought I'd lost you forever." Andrew clung to him, the years of longing and uncertainty pouring out in that moment. "Dad," he whispered the word, strange and familiar all at once. "I can't believe it. I'm so sorry. I couldn't remember." "There's nothing to apologize for," Arthur said firmly, pulling back to look at him. "You were taken from us. But we're together now, and that's what matters." For a few minutes they sat together, letting the reality of their reunion sink in. But soon, the weight of what still needed to be done settled over them both. Andrew's expression hardened as he wiped away his last tear. Andrew's jaw tightened, his grip still firm on James's arm, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "What do you mean, James?" he demanded, his voice low and steady. "What forces are you talking about?" James's lips curled into a cruel smile, and for a moment Arthur was almost convinced that his brother was enjoying this, enjoying watching them squirm. "You really have no idea, do you?" James said, his voice almost mocking. "You think this is just about me? That I'm the puppet master pulling all the strings? You've barely even scratched the surface, Arthur. This goes much deeper than you could possibly imagine." Arthur's hand clenched into a fist. "Enough with the riddles, James." His voice was cold, cutting through the tension in the room. "You know what we came here for. Tell us everything. All of it." For a moment it seemed like James might comply. His gaze shifted between Arthur and Andrew, and the glint of smugness faded just a fraction. But then, just as quickly, his expression darkened again. "You think you've got me cornered? That you can just waltz in here and drag me into the light? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Arthur's patience, already stretched thin, snapped. He stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're going to pay for what you did to our family. All the lies, the manipulation, the destruction, you won't get away with it." But James only laughed. A low, bitter laugh that made Arthur's stomach twist. "You think you're the first person to try and take me down, Arthur? The first to think they can bring me to justice?" Arthur's mind raced, trying to piece together what James was hinting at. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, barely containing his growing frustration. James's expression turned cold, the smirk fading into something more sinister. "You don't get it. This isn't just about a family feud. This isn't about revenge for some accident. This is bigger. There are people involved in this that you will never even see coming. People with power, people who have been controlling things from the shadows for years. I'm not the mastermind here. I'm just a piece of the puzzle." Andrew stiffened, his eyes locking onto James with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Are you saying you didn't do this on your own? That someone else is behind all of this?" James tilted his head, a dangerous gleam in his eye. I've always been good at playing the role of the villain, haven't I? But the truth is I'm just a tool. A pawn in a much bigger game. Arthur felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. Who's pulling the strings, James? Who? He pressed, his voice tightening with urgency. For a brief moment, James's eyes flickered to something behind Arthur, almost as if he were considering whether or not to reveal more. But then, just as quickly, he returned his gaze to Arthur and Andrew, his eyes hardening. You really think I'm going to give you names? After everything I've done to protect you? He sneered. You wouldn't last a day if you knew the truth. Andrew's grip tightened once more, and this time, his voice was low and deadly. Stop playing games, James. You've been hiding behind this wall of lies long enough. You're going to tell us what we need to know, or I swear. Before Andrew could finish, James raised his hand, his expression darkening. Do you really think I'm the one who should be afraid here? You have no idea what you're walking into. If you keep pushing me, if you keep digging, you'll regret it. There are people out there who will make sure of it. Arthur's heart raced, a sense of dread washing over him as the weight of James's words settled in. Was it possible? Had they underestimated the depth of the web James was tangled in? And if what James said was true, if there were powerful forces involved, how far would they go to protect themselves? You're threatening my family now? Arthur said, the words barely escaping through gritted teeth. James's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, there was something more than smugness in his gaze, something darker, more calculating. I'm not threatening you, Arthur. I'm warning you. You don't know what you're about to unleash. Take me down and you'll make yourself a target. There's no going back from that. Arthur's pulse hammered in his ears. For years, James had been the villain in his life, but now for the first time, Arthur was starting to see just how dangerous the situation really was. James had always been ruthless, but if he was telling the truth, if there were powerful people involved, Arthur wasn't sure if he could protect Andrew, or anyone else from the storm they were about to walk into. Andrew's grip on James's arm slackened, but only slightly. You're not getting away with this, James. Not now. Not ever. Arthur's gaze flicked to Andrew. He could see the fury in his son's eyes, the same fury that had once burned in his own. They couldn't back down now. They had the evidence. They had the truth. But the threat James had just made echoed in Arthur's mind. Arthur took a deep breath, steeling himself. We're done here. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot. James's cold smile returned.
No, Arthur.
It's only just begun. Arthur turned on his heel, motioning for Andrew to follow. As they left the study, the heavy weight of James's words settled over him like a suffocating fog. They had no idea who or what they were really up against, but Arthur knew one thing. They were already in too deep to turn back. And whatever it was, whatever came next, he and Andrew would face it together. Was James really just a pawn in a larger scheme? Who are they? Andrew snapped, his voice thick with frustration. Who's behind all of this? James glanced at Andrew, and for a brief moment, something that resembled pity flickered in his eyes. You've always been so quick to jump into battles you don't fully understand, Andrew, he said softly. This is far bigger than either of us. Before either of them could respond, James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black device. Arthur barely had time to process what it was before James pressed a button, and the mansion was suddenly filled with a loud, shrieking alarm. Damn it, James! Arthur yelled, realizing too late what his brother had just triggered. The alarm wasn't just noise. It was a signal. One that would undoubtedly summon reinforcements. Reinforcements loyal to James. Worse, they were probably involved in whatever dark conspiracy he had alluded to. We need to get out of here, Andrew urged, grabbing Arthur's arm. Now. But James wasn't finished. Even as the alarm blared on, he moved with unsettling speed, reaching for the drawer head opened earlier. This time he managed to pull out a small silver pistol, aiming it directly at Arthur with cold, deadly intent. You should have left things alone, Arthur, James hissed, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. Now you've sealed all our fates. Arthur froze, his mind racing. He had known facing James could be dangerous, but this was beyond anything he had ever prepared for. What had begun as a tense confrontation had now escalated into a life-or-death struggle, with no room for hesitation. Without warning, Andrew lunged, trying to wrest the gun from James's grasp. The two men collided, struggling for control of the weapon, their movements almost drowned out by the wailing alarm. Arthur stood frozen, his stomach tied in knots, watching them fight with desperate intensity, the gun twisting between them. The threat of it firing at any second hung over them like a shadow. "Arthur, help him!" Andrew's strained voice rang out, desperation seeping into his words as he fought to disarm James. Shaking off his shock, Arthur sprang into action, moving to grab the gun from James's other hand. But James was stronger than he expected, driven by a mix of fury and fear. The shot rang out, sharp and deafening, the sound of the bullet ricocheting off the air as it shattered a nearby window. The struggle continued, but Arthur could see that James was beginning to tire, his movements slowing. With a powerful punch, Andrew drove his fist into James's jaw, sending him stumbling backward. The gun fell to the floor with a loud clatter, and Arthur quickly kicked it out of reach. For a brief moment, the three of them just stood there, panting heavily, the blaring alarm still echoing around them. James wiped blood from his lip, glaring at them with pure venom in his eyes. "This isn't over," James spat, his voice dripping with hatred. "You may have won this round, but you'll never escape this. You've started something you can't finish." Arthur felt a surge of both anger and icy fear. He knew that James wasn't making idle threats. Whatever dark forces James was tangled up with, whatever twisted conspiracy he had gotten involved in, they weren't done. And now they would be coming after Arthur and Andrew. Before Arthur could respond, the door to the study crashed open, and several of James's men, security guards loyal to him, rushed in, weapons drawn. "Get out of here!" Andrew shouted, pushing Arthur toward the door. "I'll hold them off." "No," Arthur protested, but Andrew was already grabbing the gun from the floor, aiming it at the approaching guards. "Go, Dad," Andrew urged, his voice firm. "I'll be right behind you." Arthur hesitated for a moment, but then, with his heart pounding in his chest, he turned and ran. The sounds of gunfire echoed behind him as he sprinted down the hallway, his mind racing with panic and confusion. Every part of him screamed to keep moving, to get out of there before it was too late. But as he reached the front door and burst into the cold night air, his heart skipped a beat. He couldn't resist looking back. The mansion loomed behind him like a war zone, and the thought that he had just lost Andrew again nearly crushed him. Arthur pushed the fear down and ran to his car, trying to steady his breathing. He had to get help, and fast. He couldn't afford to lose Andrew, not again. As he sped away from the mansion, the drive felt like the longest of his life. The night air was cool against his skin, but sweat drenched his palms as he gripped the steering wheel. His mind was in chaos, fear, anger, guilt swirling around him. Had he made things worse for Andrew? Had his confrontation with James pushed his son into even greater danger? He needed to regroup. He needed a plan. And he knew exactly who to call. He pulled off the road, parking in a quiet spot, and dialed Tom Riley. The investigator answered on the second ring. "Arthur, what's happening?" Tom's voice was filled with concern. "I've been tracking your movements since you went to see James. What went down?" "James triggered an alarm," Arthur explained, trying to keep his voice steady. "Things escalated fast. Andrew's still in there and I'm worried. More of James's people are on their way. We need to act quickly." "Stay where you are," Tom instructed calmly. "I've already alerted some contacts and law enforcement. We'll get Andrew out, but we need to be smart about it. We don't know how many people James has on his payroll or how deep this conspiracy goes." Arthur nodded, even though Tom couldn't see him. "Just hurry. I can't lose him again." "We'll get him out, Arthur," Tom said, his voice reassuring. "Sit tight. I'm on my way." As Arthur waited for Tom to arrive, his mind returned to the confrontation with James. His brother's warning still echoed in his mind. This wasn't just about family anymore. They were up against something far darker, forces that had been working behind the scenes for years. Finally, Tom's headlights appeared on the horizon, and Arthur felt a wave of relief as the investigator pulled up beside him. Tom climbed out of the car, his expression grim but determined. "Arthur," he said, handing him a bulletproof vest, "we're going to do this carefully. We've got backup, but we can't just go charging in. Our priority is finding Andrew and getting him out without escalating things further." Arthur slipped on the vest, his heart hammering in his chest. Let's do this. They drove back to James's mansion in silence, the tension thick between them as they neared the estate. Flashing police lights lit up the road ahead. Tom's contacts had already arrived. We've got the place surrounded, Tom said, his eyes scanning the scene. James won't be slipping away, but our first priority is finding Andrew before anything else happens. They parked at a safe distance and Tom led the way, joining a small team of officers as they prepared to breach the mansion. Arthur's pulse quickened as they moved quietly through the shadows, approaching the house with careful precision. At Tom's signal, the team stormed the front entrance, moving swiftly through the darkened hallways. Arthur's heart was in his throat as they checked room after room, finding nothing but the remnants of chaos. Finally, they reached the study, the last place Arthur had seen Andrew and James. The door was slightly ajar, and Tom signaled for them to proceed cautiously. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as he stepped inside. The room was a wreck. Books and papers scattered across the floor, furniture overturned, and the lingering smell of gunpowder in the air. But it was the figure slumped against the wall that stopped him cold. A pool of blood spreading beneath him. Andrew! Arthur rushed forward, heart pounding, as he dropped to his knees beside his son. Andrew's face was ashen, his eyes barely open, but at least he was still breathing. He gripped his side where blood was seeping through his fingers. Dad, Andrew's voice was weak, but he managed a faint, painful smile. Guess I didn't make it out as fast as I thought. Arthur's eyes welled with tears as he pressed his hand over the wound, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. Hold on, Andrew, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Help's on the way. You're going to be okay. Tom was already on the radio, urgently calling for medical assistance. The officers were moving swiftly, securing the area and ensuring that James wasn't still lurking somewhere in the mansion. But Arthur couldn't tear his eyes away from his son. Stay with me, Andrew, Arthur urged, his voice trembling. I'm not losing you again. Andrew winced as he tried to sit up, his breath coming in ragged gasps. James, he got away, he said. He said this was just the beginning. Arthur's blood turned to ice. James had escaped, and if his words held any truth, the danger was far from over. Don't worry about James right now, Arthur said, his tone hardening with resolve. We'll get you out of here, and then we'll figure the rest out. Moments later, the paramedics arrived, and Arthur stood by helplessly as they worked to stabilize Andrew. His mind was racing, caught in a whirlwind of fear and guilt. He had almost lost his son again, so close to everything slipping through his fingers. But Andrew was a fighter, just like his mother, and Arthur knew that no matter how bad things seemed, his son would pull through. As they wheeled Andrew out on a stretcher, Arthur followed closely, his heart heavy with the weight of the knowledge that James was still out there, still planning his next move. The fight was far from over, but Arthur wasn't about to let his brother, or anyone else, tear his family apart again. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, Tom pulled Arthur aside, his expression grave. We need to talk about what happens next, Tom said, his voice low. Arthur, James is dangerous, and if he's working with someone else, we need to find out who. Before they come after you or Andrew again. Arthur nodded, his jaw set in a firm line. Whatever it takes, Tom. I'm not backing down now. Tom's hand landed reassuringly on Arthur's shoulder. We'll get through this together. The ambulance sped off, its sirens cutting through the night, and Arthur watched it disappear into the distance, his heart aching but his mind focused. The battle against James had taken a heavy toll, but Arthur knew he had to stay strong. For Andrew, for Valerie, and for the future they still had a chance to build. As he and Tom headed back to their cars, Arthur glanced up at the night sky, his mind already turning toward the road ahead. The final confrontation with James was coming, and this time there would be no escape. The following days blurred together. Hospital visits, police reports, and sleepless nights. Arthur spent every moment he could at Andrew's side, watching as his son slowly recovered from the gunshot wound he'd sustained during the confrontation with James. The doctors were hopeful, but they couldn't offer any clear timeline on when Andrew would fully heal, both physically and emotionally. Despite the pain and exhaustion, Andrew remained as tough as ever. Arthur could see the spark in his son's eyes, the unwavering determination to get through this and come out the other side stronger. But beneath that resolve, a dark shadow loomed over them both, The knowledge that James was still out there, and that the fight was far from over. Arthur had spent countless hours with Tom Riley, combing through every lead in the investigation, trying to make sense of the cryptic warning James had given, that they had only scratched the surface. It was becoming clear that James had been tangled up in something much bigger, something that reached far beyond his personal vendetta against Arthur. There were people out there, powerful people, who had manipulated James into thinking he was nothing more than a pawn in their game. One afternoon, as Arthur sat quietly beside Andrew's bed, the door to the room creaked open. Tom stepped inside, his expression grim, and Arthur immediately sensed that something significant had come to light. "Arthur," Tom said quietly, glancing at Andrew, who was now dozing. "We need to talk. Do you want to step outside?" Arthur shook his head. "No. Let's talk here. Andrew needs to hear this too." Tom nodded, pulling up a chair and sitting beside Arthur. He took a slow breath before speaking, his tone heavy. "We've been digging into James's connections, trying to figure out who else might be involved," Tom began, his voice low. "And we found something. It's big." Arthur leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What is it?" "There's a group," Tom continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "A shadowy organization that operates behind the scenes, pulling strings in business, politics, law enforcement, you name it. They're known as the Syndicate." Arthur's blood ran cold. He'd heard whispers of such organizations before, but he never imagined one could be tied to his own family. "The Syndicate has been around for decades, maybe longer," Tom explained. "They specialize in manipulating events to further their own interests, often at the expense of others. James was working with them, or more accurately for them." Andrew, who had been listening intently, stirred and opened his eyes. His face was grim. So James wasn't the mastermind behind everything. Tom shook his head. "No. James was ambitious, but he was never the one pulling the strings. The Syndicate used him to achieve their goals. They wanted control over your family's wealth and influence. When the accident happened 18 years ago, it was supposed to eliminate you, Arthur, and anyone who stood in their way. But when that plan failed, they used James to cover it up and keep Valerie hidden." A wave of nausea washed over Arthur as the full scope of the conspiracy began to sink in. "So all of this," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief, "it was never just about James's jealousy or greed. It was about something much bigger." "Exactly," Tom confirmed. "And now that James has gone rogue, they see him as a liability. They'll be coming after him, and anyone else who knows too much." Andrew's face hardened, his fists clenching. "Which means they're coming after us too." Tom nodded solemnly. "That's why we need to be ready. The Syndicate is ruthless. They won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who poses a threat to them. But we're not defenseless. We have evidence and we have people on our side. We can fight back." Arthur's mind raced as he processed everything. The thought of going up against an organization like the Syndicate was terrifying, but the idea of letting them continue their reign of terror was even worse. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "We go public," Tom said without hesitation. "We take everything we know, the Syndicate's involvement, James's role, and we expose it. Once the truth is out there, they won't be able to operate from the shadows anymore. They'll be forced to retreat, at least for a while." Andrew's eyes glinted with resolve. "We can't let them get away with this. We have to make sure everyone knows what they've done." Arthur felt a swell of pride in his chest as he looked at his son. Even though Andrew had just been through hell, he was ready to stand up and fight, just as Valerie would have done. Arthur reached out and took Andrew's hand, squeezing it tightly. "We'll do this together," Arthur said, his voice resolute. "We'll make sure they pay for what they've done to our family." Tom gave a small, sad smile in return. "It won't be easy, Arthur. It won't come without risks, but it's the right thing to do." Over the next few days, Arthur, Andrew, and Tom threw themselves into preparing for the fight ahead. They collected every piece of evidence they could find. Documents, recordings, testimonies, and slowly began to piece together a case that would expose the Syndicate's operations. They reached out to trusted journalists, law enforcement officials, and allies who could help them bring the truth to the surface. But despite their progress, Arthur couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were being watched. He had the distinct sense that the Syndicate was already aware of their plans. The air felt thick with tension, every movement scrutinized, every shadow hiding a potential threat. Then, at long last, the day came when they were ready to go public. Arthur and Andrew stood together at a press conference, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The cameras flashed in rapid succession, and the reporters murmured in anticipation as Arthur stepped up to the microphone. "My name is Arthur Cunningham," he began, his voice steady and unwavering. "For years my family has been the target of a conspiracy, one that has cost us more than you can imagine. Today we're here to expose the truth about the organization known as the Syndicate, and to hold those responsible accountable for their actions." As he spoke, Arthur felt a deep sense of resolve take root inside him. This was the moment they'd been working toward. A moment to finally take control of their own narrative. Yet, even as the press conference unfolded, a sense of unease lingered in the back of his mind. He knew this was just the beginning. The Syndicate was a formidable force, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. After the press conference, as Arthur and Andrew were leaving the venue, Tom pulled Arthur aside, his expression grave. "Arthur," Tom said quietly, his voice heavy with caution, "we did the right thing today. But we need to be careful. The Syndicate won't just fade away. They'll regroup and they'll come after us with everything they've got." Arthur's jaw tightened, his determination unshaken. "Let them come," he replied. "We're ready." But as he watched Andrew speaking with reporters, a sense of foreboding settled over Arthur's chest. They'd taken the first step, but the road ahead was bound to be filled with danger. That night, as Arthur lay awake in bed, the weight of the day's events pressed on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Syndicate was already plotting its next move. The battle for justice, this fight to protect his family, was far from over. The darkness that had haunted them for so long was still lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Arthur wasn't afraid. He had his son, his allies, and the truth on his side. This time he was ready for whatever came next. And he vowed that, no matter what, he wouldn't let the shadows win.